So good evening, good morning to everyone, depending upon where you are. My name is Happy Mon Jacob, and I teach at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. And I recently co-founded the Council for Strategic and Defense Research with Lieutenant General D.S. Hooda, who is also a panelist today with us. So welcome to the CSDR roundtable on a year of reckoning, Afghanistan 2021. Afghanistan is clearly at a major crossroads today with the United States troops withdrawing from Afghanistan, Taliban on the rise, and the regional geopolitics on the Afghan question in a flux. What seems to be clear is that the Taliban is most likely to gain power in Afghanistan in one form or another. I don't mind being contradicted on that. What is not clear is how soon it will happen and what would be the nature of such a power sharing arrangement should there be a power sharing arrangement. What is also clear is that the Taliban have a lot more support in the region and beyond today than was the case in 1996 when they first came to power in Kabul. What is not known to us today is the nature of the Taliban itself. Are Taliban 2.0 any different from Taliban 1.0? While Taliban 1.0 was greatly dependent on Pakistan, will Taliban 2.0 be less dependent on Pakistan? And as a consequence, be more open to forging relationships with other countries, including, say, India? Put differently, are the Taliban more worldly wise today? Have they been socialized into how the international system functions and the norms and principles and do's and don'ts of such a system? More importantly for us, how should India view the developments in Afghanistan? The Indian strategic elite seems to be split on the question of whether or not it is a good idea to openly engage the Taliban. At least one of our panelists today, Ambassador Vivek, Katju, a former Indian ambassador to Kabul, is on record arguing for open engagement with the Taliban. So we have a star-studded panel this evening. Let me briefly introduce them to you. Tamim Asey is the founder and executive chairman of the Institute of War and Peace Studies. He's a former deputy minister for policy and strategy at the Ministry of Defense and at the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Ambassador Rakesh Sood served as India's first ambassador and permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and later as ambassador to Afghanistan, Nepal, and France after retiring in 2013. He served as special envoy of the Prime Minister of India for disarmament and non-proliferation till May 2014. Ambassador Rustam Shah Mohammed has served as Chief Secretary of the Northwest Frontier Province, Interior Secretary of Pakistan, Pakistan's Ambassador to Afghanistan, and Commissioner for Afghan Refugees. He is currently a leader of Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf and a member of the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Advisory Committee, which advises the provincial government on development and planning. I have had the opportunity to meet and exchange views with Rustam Saab on several occasions, and good to have him here. Ms. Tamanna Salikuddin is Director of South Asia Programs at the United States Institute of Peace, Washington, D.C. From 2014 to 2017, she was a senior advisor to the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the US Department of State. During this time, Salikuddin led a team of experts pursuing a peace process between the Afghan Taliban and the government of Afghanistan. She represented the United States at the historic Murray talks in 2015 and participated in other high-level negotiations. From 2011 to 2013, she served as Director for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the US National Security Council, focusing on US-Pakistan relations and the Afghanistan peace process. Lieutenant General D.S. Hooda is a former Northern Army commander of the Indian Army. In 2019, Lieutenant General Hooda authored a comprehensive national security document. He is one of India's foremost commentators on national security and is the co-founder of CSDR. Last but not the least, we have Ambassador Vivek, a former Indian ambassador to Afghanistan. He also served as India's ambassador to Myanmar and Thailand. Ambassador Katju was one of India's chief negotiators during the Kandahar hijack of IC-814 when he headed the Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran desk at the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi. So just a few housekeeping announcements. Each speaker may kindly limit their initial remarks to about 7 to 8 minutes, maximum 9 minutes. Audience members can put their questions in the Q&A box while these comments are being made. Initial comments will be followed by a discussion where I pick some questions from the Q&A box. And depending on how much time we have left, we will then move on to other unanswered questions. So audience, please keep your questions precise and if possible, do indicate who they are addressed to. So without much any more delay, let us begin this discussion in the order that we have here. May I request Mr. Tamim Asey to give his initial remarks, please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much for having me. It's such a pleasure and honor to be amongst this distinguished panelists. Let me begin by explaining the regional situation on Afghanistan and where we stand, and then effectively jump into a few concrete suggestions. The region is divided when it comes to Afghanistan, and effectively, when you look at both near neighbors of Afghanistan as well as the far neighbors, the near neighbors being the ones which share borders with Afghanistan, you can categorize them into three categories. The first one, as I call them, are the influencers, the major power brokers. And these are like countries like Pakistan, Iran, as well as Russia, which we indirectly share a border with, who are the movers and shakers and who are also either the direct beneficiary or the direct, will be directly affected by the developments in Afghanistan. They pursue at least three different narratives, and they are all not on the same page, not even at some basic minimum set of interests when it comes to Afghanistan. First being not to turn Afghanistan, preventing Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven. Second being a peaceful settlement. Third being that the Afghan war needs to end. They don't even have a basic understanding on these three things. The second category of countries are effectively especially within the near neighbors of Afghanistan, are the followers who either fit within the Pakistani camp, the Iranian camp, or the Russian camp. And these countries adjust their policies when it comes to Afghanistan into one of those three categories, or at least follow the lead of one of these three countries because they believe they don't have the resources, the insight, the understanding, as well as the networks and contacts that's required to influence developments inside of Afghanistan. And the third category of the countries are watchers. They are effectively watching the developments in Afghanistan and confine their activities within statements or UN General Assembly votes or some other international forums. Now that's in terms of the near neighbors of Afghanistan. In terms of the far neighbors of Afghanistan, and I define far neighbors of Afghanistan as countries which does not necessarily share a border with Afghanistan, but have a lot of political, economic, development, religious influence on Afghanistan, historical influence. And in that being India, Turkey, Qatar nowadays, Saudi Arabia, and others. These countries, even though they have enormous influence when it comes to the political, economic, military developments in Afghanistan, but because historically they've either partnered with a near neighbor or they have used their financial instruments or political instruments or religious instruments, they're also not on the same page when it comes to Afghanistan, and they're effectively in competition. So it is a divided house when it comes to the region and when it comes to the neighbors of Afghanistan of how they should tackle the developments. And the region, if they don't agree on a set of minimum expectations or minimum interests in Afghanistan, will pay a price for it, as history has shown, in terms of humanitarian spillover effects, in terms of security spillover effects, and in terms of hampering the economic and financial development of their projects. For example, China's BRI Western corridor will be dearly affected by if Afghanistan descends into chaos. Central Asian certain developments, projects and energy schemes would be affected. The rate of growth of the Pakistani economic growth will be affected because of the humanitarian effect, humanitarian spillover effects. Pakistan will be much more destabilized if Afghanistan descends into chaos. And if people within the region, the policymakers, the national security practitioners and others are thinking that they could go for a containment policy, just like in the 1990s, it is a big mistake. It's a repetition of history that if you're thinking beyond a political settlement in Afghanistan and you think you can overwrite that and then manage the chaos here, type of a managed war that will not affect you, this fire will actually engulf the region as well. Therefore, there are regional frameworks as well as regional groupings that could influence the developments in Afghanistan. And they have certain set of instruments, including the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and a dozen other regional organizations that have platforms for Afghanistan or action plans or other programs and policies. Now, some people question the feasibility and the effectiveness of regional organizations in Afghanistan, but not a single country could influence Afghanistan when it comes to stabilizing it or destabilizing it. I don't buy into this narrative of elephant in the room. In fact, there are too many elephants in the room who can influence the narratives in Afghanistan. I mean, Pakistan being the biggest elephant, but of course, there are others who are counterweighing, Pakistan's influence when it comes to Afghanistan for their own national security reasons. Now, with the United States withdrawal, as well as with NATO forces withdrawal, what they have effectively done is they have Afghanized and regionalized the Afghan dilemma or the Afghan problem. So they're focusing a lot on CT and then other narrow national security interests they have. But effectively now they are letting the Afghan problem to be solved by the Afghans in the region, which is a repetition of the 1990s. But they also have a responsibility in terms of its management. Now, in terms of certain suggestions of the way out when it comes to Afghanistan, how the region should approach the Afghan problem. There are three views. The first one is that Afghanistan should be declared as a permanent neutral state by the UN Security Council and UN General Assembly, like Turkmenistan and others. And then a mechanism should be fetched on how to support Afghanistan financially as well as militarily. That's one way out. The second way is, or the second view when it comes to Afghanistan, is that the Afghan government should get into some sort of a strategic partnership agreement with its neighbors, including, including dialogues with Pakistan as being the biggest protagonist and supporter of the Taliban. And that discussion has been going on through a strategic dialogue. And I believe some of our foreign friends and Western friends are helping on that front. I'm very skeptical if it would work. In fact, pessimistic. But again, that's one view that could be considered. And in the final view, and with this I would wrap up my intervention here, is that the current government effectively negotiates a political settlement with the Taliban. And then both the Taliban, as well as the current government and the future government setup, would get into a new partnership with the region and redefine its relations with the region and the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Asey, for those very insightful remarks. May I now request Ambassador Rakesh Sood to take the floor and give his initial remarks, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Happy Mon. And I think it is wonderful to see old friends and talking about a subject which is so relevant to us today in this region. Because I've always maintained that while the US can take the view that we've seen a lot of US writings, it's always talks of the end game has begun, or, the US is ending its war and things like that. I mean, the US has the luxury of disengagement, and the US also has the resources to come back if were something nasty to happen, let's say. But I think that as far as the Afghans are concerned, there is really no end game in sight. The conflict continues. As far as the region is concerned, I think Tamim has already spelled out the difficulties of the region. So let me start from there. I think one of the big problems with the so-called Doha Agreement and the whole process is that it was never, well, okay. I think, to be fair, Ambassador Khalilzad started by talking about 4 issues when he said that we are talking about 4 subjects. We are talking of ceasefire. There will be cutting off of ties with the international terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda by the Taliban. There will be an intra-Afghan peace dialogue, and there will be withdrawal of the US and other foreign forces. And he emphasized that nothing is agreed till everything is agreed, which is normally standard diplomatic practice. But unfortunately, he didn't have a plan B. And so ultimately, we ended up with the ISI Taliban plan A, namely an unconditional withdrawal in return for a safe passage. So that's what the reality is. And I think that the difficulty now with the intra-Afghan thing, which was always there, is that there is no guarantor and there is no moderator. And I think that is one of the difficulties with, something that Tamim said. He talked of a neutral state. I mean, a neutral state guaranteed by whom? And that leads us to a problem, because, and even if by some fluke, by some magic wand or something like that, even if the region agrees to create a neutral state for Afghanistan, what does that do to the fighting inside Afghanistan? I mean, you're creating a neutral state for an Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, or what? So I think that it is also quite clear that the ties between the Taliban and the terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and so on are fairly robust at the moment. In fact, the most recent UN report that came out on 2nd of June makes that abundantly clear. So I think we are in for a very, very troubled kind of a time. And I don't see an end game, and I don't see the end of conflict. In fact, I see a gradual fragmentation. But the key thing here, and this is the unknown factor, is that we don't know a number of things. I mean, we know that Afghanistan has changed from from the last 20 years. We know about Afghanistan's demographics, the fact that 70% of its population is below 30 years of age, so which means that they have largely grown up in a relatively open society, even though it may be a conservative society, but at least an open society. But what we don't know is whether the Taliban have changed. And so far, the Taliban have been quite obfuscatory in terms of addressing any of these issues. I mean, they still keep talking about the Islamic Emirate. In fact, the agreement that they signed with the US says very categorically, and this to me is the strangest thing, that the very title of the agreement says agreement between the United States of America and the Taliban, the Islamic Emirates of Taliban, which is not recognized by the United States of America. I mean, so you have an agreement between two entities, and the two entities don't really recognize each other. So, I mean, it's a strange thing. And then the UN Security Council endorses it unanimously. But then international politics is always strange in these matters. And this third question, to which we don't have an answer, is, has Pakistan changed? I mean, Pakistan has admittedly paid a heavy price in terms of its engagement with the jihad and the whole concept of jihad. And there has been enormous radicalization in Pakistan. And there have been a number of groups that have emerged from Pakistan. The TTP, I mean, the fact that Pakistan was hosting various international groups, many of whom are now both in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and they straddle the border. And these include the Uyghurs, these include the Uzbeks, these include other splinter groups of the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. These include groups that have returned, battle-hardened groups that have returned from Syria, such as the Khatibzadeh Imam al-Bukhari and so on. So who controls them? And I think these are questions to which we don't really have any answers. So as far as the Afghans are concerned, and as far as the region is concerned, I think we are in for a very, very long haul. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Sood. May I now request Ambassador Sumsa Moment to give his remarks, please. Sir, please unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Can
absolutely.
you hear me now?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be part of such very enlightened discussion by very eminent participants. I'm not going to necessarily, first of all, let me clarify that I have left the PTI long ago, and I'm not part of any political party at this point in time. And I have nothing to do with the government, either at the provincial level or at the federal level. So my views are entirely my own. And they are, as you would see, at variance with the views and the standpoint of the government. Let me start by saying that this was an unnecessary conflict, war, and the American general, Douglas Lute, in the leaked papers, says we did not know what we are doing in Afghanistan and what we are trying to achieve in Afghanistan. And Mr. General Douglas Lute was no ordinary general. He was advisor to President Bush, and he was also advisor to President Obama. At the end of 20 years of occupation, how does Afghanistan look like today? More than 3.5 million IDPs. Economy has nosedived. Unemployment is high, more than 55%. Opium production has gone up to 7,500 tons. Drug addiction has crossed all limits. Poverty is acute. People are leaving in large numbers. They're going to Iran, Turkey, on to Europe. Many have been drowned in the sea. Some of them were recruited for the Syrian militias to fight for Bashar al-Assad. It's a dismal situation. and it continues to worsen with every passing day. The government is in control of not more than 40% of the area. Some 50% or less than 50% is under the control of Taliban. The rest of the area is contested. Of course, the Taliban in their latest offensive now have control of more than 200 districts, about 220 districts, where they collect taxes and administer the area and provide also basic services. And this is expanding constantly. The important thing to note is that Taliban have not captured these areas by force, but the security forces have surrendered in 95% of the cases. So far, more than 25,000 security personnel have surrendered to the Taliban. More than 4,000 armored vehicles, tanks, etc., have come into their possession. 9 dams are in their possession now, and they control the border crossing between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan, between Turkmenistan and Afghanistan, between Iran and Afghanistan, and one border crossing between Pakistan and Afghanistan. This is the roughly the situation. Now, I think from the point of view of the current discussion, it is important to project views and perceptions on how to get out of this mess, how to resolve the issue. If you consider the present situation, I think there are, from a pragmatic and down to earth and a realistic point of view, there are only 2 solutions. One is, in my view, that under pressure from America, the Afghan government shows more flexibility and accommodation and agrees to the convening of a Grand Assembly, that very fine, that very historic Afghan institution of Loy Jirga, or Grand Assembly. That Grand Assembly would install a transitional government that would include the Taliban, but also would include other factions, all ethnicities, Uzbeks, Turkmen, Baloch, Tajiks, Hazaras. And of course, they would deliver peace because they will have mass following. Let me say just in passing that Afghans are fed up of war. Now they have had it for 40 years, since 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. So they want peace more than any other thing. Who delivers peace? Most Afghans wouldn't be very bothered, wouldn't be very concerned, as long as the fighting stops. That will be one way out. Last time also, 5 years ago, when there was this tussle between Ashraf Ghani and Dr. Abdullah, John Kerry came all the way from Washington, and on his advice, of course, they decided to settle the issue. And in that time also, there was a Grand Jirga, a Grand Assembly, Loy Jirga, and the Loy Jirga created the position of a chief executive, which was not there in the Afghan constitution. But the Loy Jirga can impose its own decisions, and they have to be accepted by everybody. And that system then worked. So this Loy Jirga Grand Assembly is one option. But of course, in this case, the government will, the current leaders will have to make room for the transitional government. Whether they would do it, because in my personal view, Ghani's government remains the biggest obstacle now to peace, because they would not go along with any settlement that would come at their expense, at their cost. The second way out would be that the Taliban gradually make inroads and move slowly and gradually and take power and form a government, again a multi-ethnic broad-based government, because I do not believe the Taliban can rule Afghanistan to the exclusion of other factions. They have to have all other factions on board in order to create conditions for return to normalcy. The trouble is that in the meantime, what the government has done is that it is encouraging the creation of private militias. This is a very ominous development. Private militias are being formed on the basis of ethnicity. Uzbek militia and Tajik militia, the Hazara militia. The idea is twofold. Number one, that these militias would engage the Taliban locally so that their advance on major cities could be blocked and prevented. And number two, that as a consequence, if there is the prospect of a civil war, the Afghan government can appeal to the international community to come to their help. I don't think that is going to work. But the creation of militias would certainly be a recipe for a civil war that would then loom on the horizon, and Afghanistan would descend in chaos and anarchy. The role of the regional players, China has a huge investment in Afghanistan, in copper mining in Logar province, oil and gas in northern Afghanistan, and then their flagship project, one Belt and Road Initiative, the extension of CPAC. So China is vitally interested in peace in Afghanistan because of their investment and because of their concern, because the One Belt One Road, this portion of the project would only be successfully executed if there is peace in Afghanistan. China, Russia, Iran, all three countries have warmed up to the Taliban, have established contacts with Taliban for the simple reason that all three countries consider Daesh to be posing a threat to their security. And they believe that only a government that includes Taliban could destroy the brutal outfit of Daesh in Afghanistan, and the danger to their frontiers, to their borders, would disappear only if there is a strong government which has the backing of the people and which can defeat and annihilate and destroy not only Daesh but also Fidai Mahaz in the other Turkestan Islamic movement, Uzbekistan Islamic movement, because Taliban would not allow any other such outfit to exist or function, which would affect their relations with neighboring countries. Let me clarify that Taliban is not a pan-Islamist movement. It is only confined to the borders of Afghanistan. It doesn't export any ideology. It's not like Jamaat Islami of Pakistan or Jamaat Islami of Bangladesh or Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt. It is just about the enforcement of Islamic system within Afghanistan. Then, of course, as I said, Iran is having good context now with Taliban, Russia also. There is a wide perception in Pakistan that India is acting as a spoiler, and that India doesn't want peace in Afghanistan, so on and so forth. I have been consistently opposing this perception, this view, in all my TV talk shows and my writings. And I believe that India has a contribution, an investment of more than $3 billion. And India would like to protect that investment. India has a trade of more than $1.3 billion with Afghanistan. And India is in need of the hydrocarbon resources of Central Asia, and Afghanistan would be a springboard for importing of oil and gas from Central Asia. So why should India see a destabilized Afghanistan as being in its own interest? Of course, Pakistan would demand, and any government that will come into power in Afghanistan would have to listen to this, that Afghan territory would not be covertly or overtly used against Pakistan's interests. But beyond that, I think Afghanistan should be regarded as an independent sovereign country. India and Afghanistan have had historic relations stretching over 2,000 years. Even if the Taliban come into power, in my view, they will have good relations with India. Afghanistan needs help. India is providing help. There should be nothing wrong with that in principle. And I think that the Taliban are very pragmatic. They already have announced general amnesty for all. They have also announced that women would be empowered to work and also to get higher education. And they've also said that their government will be multi-ethnic and broad-based, and nobody would be excluded. So these are, in my view, good signs. Of course, Pakistan, from Pakistan point of view, the stability of its western border is important, number one. And number two, Pakistan's relations with Central Asia, the import of Turkmenistan's gas, and from the electricity from Tajikistan, these projects would only materialize if there is peace in Afghanistan. And then Pakistan will have a big role to play in the reconstruction, rehabilitation of Afghanistan by providing technology, manpower, resources, etc., etc. And Pakistan would certainly benefit.
Rustam Saab, let's take some of these questions during the Q&A. If you could wind up, please.
Okay. Let me clarify before I close that the elements of the TTP no longer exists, Tehrik-e-Taliban of Pakistan. It has been dismantled, defeated. Some of the leaders have gone across the border, but they live as individuals. They have no organization, they have no hierarchy, they have no mandate, they have no support, they have no mass following. And in the Pakistan's tribal area now, the army is there along with the police, because police has been inducted, and the areas have been merged with Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the former Northwest Frontier province. So they are part of the provincial setup now, and the TTP elements would no longer be in a position to hide themselves anywhere in the tribal, in the erstwhile tribal area. There are some other points. I'll come later if there are any questions.
Thank you, Rustam Saab, for being so forthright and clarifying many of our questions. Let me now turn to Tamanna. Tamanna, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Hapiman. Thank you so much for inviting me, and appreciate being part of this panel to discuss such an important issue. I just want to start off, obviously I spent quite a few years in the US government and now at USIP, but these are my personal views, of course. But I do want to address some of the points others raised, and also my view of the Taliban, having spent some time with them in negotiations and in a different forum. So, you know, as the United States leaves Afghanistan after 20 years of war, there can be no doubt that the war is not over. You know, we may be saying that the war is over, but for Afghans and for the region, the war is not over, and in fact is only getting worse. In recent weeks, as many of the other speakers have said, the Taliban has advanced across the country. And without US support, the Afghan army and police have reportedly lost, you know, dozens and dozens of districts over the course of a few months, and are now fighting on the outskirts of key cities. Senior US officials here in Washington have warned of a civil war. You may have all seen, US intelligence reports are forecasting the fall of the Afghan government, which the United States worked to strengthen for 2 decades. But they're estimating that within a year, the current Afghan government may fall. So the security situation is indeed alarming. The Taliban have both psychological and military momentum as US troops depart. And we can contrast that with the Afghan National Security Forces that are losing both capacity and morale due to the rapid US troop withdrawal. And I would argue that the humanitarian situation is worsening, not only due to the violence, but also because of COVID and an ongoing severe drought in Afghanistan. The Afghan government is even more disunited now, and I would argue lacks real self-awareness of the impending disaster in Afghanistan. There can be lots of blame for US actions or inactions, but unfortunately at this point, Afghanistan's neighbors will bear much of the burden and most likely can better impact the future of the conflict rather than anyone else. None of Afghanistan's neighbors, China, Pakistan, Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, nor Russia, nor India benefit from a full Taliban takeover or descent into complete civil war. Obviously, I think many of us would agree here that Pakistan has the greatest regional influence on the trajectory of the conflict and the Taliban. The view in Washington is definitely that Pakistan got what it wanted in terms of a US exit, and that the Taliban are as a viable part of an Afghan political landscape in the future. But I think, in Washington, you'll see the view that Islamabad needs to decide what its preferred end state is and how much leverage it's willing to exert on the Taliban to get there. I think there's some differences of opinion on how much leverage Pakistan actually still has over the Taliban. Time is really of the essence to lend full support to some sort of political process and, restrict whatever, Taliban safe haven might still be in Pakistan, which really the momentum is that their military strength outweighs at points Pakistan's influence to stop them. So I would argue that what we really need is a regional consensus rather than individual countries hedging their own future. Right now, you're seeing all the countries in the region making their own deals, cutting their own, having their own dialogues with the Taliban and trying to hedge with other groups. I think the UN may try and is trying under Jean Arnault and others, but we really do also need a US role to try to unify the regional approach. On the US side, I think we can endlessly argue about what went wrong in the Afghan war, but in the end, the United States was unable to achieve its objectives or win either militarily or at the negotiating table. And I think the Biden administration's withdrawal is a tacit acknowledgement of this reality. Some may say it was a lack of will. If we only had tried harder, I worked for General Lute at the White House, and believe me, there was plenty of will to try harder. We've tried for 20 years. I think it belies the fact that the US does not see an enduring vital national security interest in Afghanistan that warrants continued expenditure of blood and treasure. Keeping a few thousand troops and maintaining the status quo in Afghanistan would have been politically tenable in the US, mostly because domestically, few Americans are actually paying much attention to Afghanistan. But those few thousand troops were only a temporary solution for the inevitable. They were not fundamentally shifting the deteriorating stalemate. They were protecting, the government to some extent and helping the Afghan National Security Forces, but they were not turning the tide of the battle. And so while the Biden administration has promised continued US monetary and diplomatic support to Afghanistan, the reality is that as troops leave, dollars and contractors will leave, and attention in Washington also wanes. You can see from the current discourse, both in Congress here and in the executive branch, the US focus right now really is on SIVs, special immigrant visas, and US embassy security. That is really where we are focused tactically, and of course on the withdrawal. And I think it is important to note, as others have, that on the withdrawal, the Taliban have not attacked US forces at all, right? So you have a withdrawal that is allowing the US to leave, not as in Vietnam where they were being shot at. The real negative implications for all of this are for the region at large. And we already see, as I said, countries scrambling to figure out what's best for their own interests and how to achieve that. I want to make a few observations about what I see going on in the region. I mean, I think the Afghan government's next major challenge is really to hold on to provincial capitals. In case a few fall, it's important to prevent panic and rapid political meltdown. Here it is important to think about that, are the Taliban actually fighting to take over Kabul, or are they fighting to get better leverage in some sort of political agreement? And I would argue that at least the political leadership within the Taliban understands that even if they get Kabul, holding Kabul and governing is much, much harder than being the insurgency that takes down, obviously, all the rural areas and then some provincial capitals. I think it's important to note that opposition leaders are very willing to cut deals on Taliban terms, and they would like to see President Ghani removed from power. I think many in the region have tired of President Ghani as well. Doha, the US mediated track in Doha, and the emerging regional peace tracks, whether it's Tehran, Islamabad, what we saw in Tashkent, they are not aligned, and they're really adding to the tensions between the different countries. And so what we really need is some alignment between these tracks. The intra-Afghan track is largely stalled, and despite Ambassador Khalilzad's, I would say, best efforts, there is not a lot of political will or push there. On the regional play, I think Pakistan and Russia seem to be strongly backing the Taliban, but again, they don't have an interest in the Taliban having a complete takeover. As Ambassador Momen pointed out, I think in the best interest would be either through a Loya Jirga or the Taliban forming a multi-party government, is seeing the Taliban as part of some representative political structure. I think Iran is pursuing a two-track strategy, one track where it supports the Taliban to reduce US influence, but also to counter Daesh. An important note is that the Taliban have had more success against Daesh than either the US or even Afghan National Security Forces. And the second one is, of course, to support some of these ethnic militias to protect Shia populations and Hazara enclaves. And China remains in Pakistan's corner, but I think it is concerned about Taliban's intransigence. I think it's very interesting where India is. I mean, I look forward to hearing from others on this, but I think the debate on whether to talk to the Taliban or not is a very interesting one in India. I think the relationship with Hamid Karzai for India is important. It would like the republic, not an emirate, obviously. And I think there is growing distance between India and President Ghani as well. Of course, I think India has been unhappy with US talks from the very beginning, in 2008, 2009, when we were starting talks. But really, in the Trump administration, seeing the way that the talks took, India saw it as against their interest and sort of bowing to Taliban and Pakistani pressure. I think the region, and especially India, should be concerned about the various terrorist groups emanating from Afghanistan, besides Taliban. These are the real threat: Al-Qaeda, Daesh, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed. Once Taliban is taking over, these groups will come out and move to other places. I think from the Taliban's part, it does want to engage with India. It would prefer that India stay neutral and not back the republic, or, it doesn't want the same repeat of the 1990s of India backing the, the Northern Alliance. So, but I would argue that even though, Happy Man, you have advocated for, actual fulsome India-Taliban talks, so far they haven't made much headway really at the getting to know each other stage. And most other countries have had talks with the Taliban for years now. And I think India, has some catching up to do with that. I want to just advocate for two things. I think, what are the things we should be focused on? Number one, I think a political settlement. This should remain our shared priority. Despite the myriad of interests across the region, a political settlement that represents different political factions in Afghanistan is in the region's interest. Whether we do it through an interim government, peace negotiations, the constitutional Loya Jirga, all of this can be worked out, but this is really the only way to stem the violence and protect civilians. The Taliban knows it cannot win the entire country militarily, but they can sustain a bloody fight. And so, we need pressure on both sides, both on the Taliban side to get them to the talk. I think by the end of the fighting season, they may feel that their position at the bargaining table has been strengthened militarily. On the other side, I think the Afghan government lacks the political or the self-awareness to think about where it is. And I think all the reports out of Tashkent lead us to see that they're not in the phase where they're ready to talk political settlement. So I think this brings us to the question that many have raised: who is the Taliban? Should India engage? And this is from my personal interactions with them at the negotiating table and other places. But the number one thing I would say about the Taliban is that we need to think of them less ideologically, right? They are a political Afghan group. They are, you can say militant, you can say they've used terrorist tactics, all of that, right? But I think just seeing them through an ideological lens limits our analysis of them. They have been able to use over the last 20 years a unique mix of Islam, of Pashtun nationalism, and of Afghan nationalism to draw a myriad of people to their cause. So it may be some people who are, who do believe in a religious setup and want the emirate, and there are others who feel that they or their interests have been, overlooked or oppressed by the current regime, by warlords, others. So there's a myriad of ways that people have joined the Taliban. So I would emphasize that it is not a monolith, right? What do they want and how you join and the power dynamics. Again, they are very pragmatic. They are all about, one, unity in their ranks. They will work very hard to give a unified face, even though it is lots of different commanders, both political and military commanders have come together under an umbrella. And that's really important. There's a big difference between the political and military leadership. So the people we talk to in Doha, the political leadership, they're former diplomats, other things, they have a very different perspective than the military commanders on the ground. And the military commanders, given how strong they are fighting, often get a veto. So I think that's important. When you meet the Taliban, the number one thing is that they are like many other Afghan politicians or warlords that you meet, right? Conservative in certain ways, but power and politics is still at the foremost of their concern. So I think we should remember that. And how have they changed in 20 years? I think people lump a lot of things together. Have they changed socially? Yes. I would argue that parts of the Taliban have changed socially, just as Afghanistan has changed socially. For example, there's plenty of Taliban political leaders whose daughters go to school in, other countries, right? They were happy to sit with me and talk to me over lunch or bring a gift for us or something like that, right? That the social part, I think, has changed. And you will see in areas that they even ruled in Afghanistan in the last 20 years, some places girls went to school, some places girls didn't. So it's not a monolith. I think what is more worrying to me is that they have not politically changed, right? The democracy and a republic are still not things that they want to talk about. And, someone alluded to the US deal. This was a sticking point in the deal.
We wind up in the next...
Sure. And they still would like to press for an emirate. So I think that's important. Lastly, the other thing I think besides political settlement, the area where we really need to concentrate, where the US should be working with the region, is on security cooperation. And here I mean all the groups besides the Taliban that are of real threat, that will impact India, that will impact the India, Pakistan, and China strategic stability. So I think there is a lot for us to discuss and unpack there as well. And I'm happy to talk more about the different parts of the political process and how the Taliban might see a political deal in the question and answer. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tamanna. May I now request General Hooda to take the floor. General Hooda, I understand that you have some very strong views on what India should do vis-a-vis the Taliban. So if you could address some of those in your remarks. Thank you.
So thank you, Happy Mon. It's a great pleasure to be here on this panel. I'm going to narrowly talk about how I think India should engage with Afghanistan, in particular with the Taliban. And I agree with Tamanna that we need a regional approach in order to solve the Afghan problem. The issue is there is no regional approach. I mean, every country is looking at things from its own perspective and from its own national interests. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So what is the kind of engagement that serves India's national interests the best? So currently there are two major players, the Afghan government and the Taliban in Afghanistan. I know there are external players and there are smaller players, but internally there are two large players, the Afghan government and Taliban. And I would argue that it's very clear that our interests, India's interests, are best served by the Afghan government and not by the Taliban. And therefore, India's basic focus must be on strengthening the Afghanistan government in its fight against Taliban. I mean, that's my argument. And in some ways, I think India's interests are also best aligned with the interests of the people of Afghanistan. I mean, would they want, an emirate, or are they happy with the kind of governance structures and rule that is existing, despite all the problems that are there among the government and the political leaders? There also seems to be an assumption that it is only a matter of time before Taliban take over the entire country. And I'm not sure whether that assumption is completely true. I mean, they haven't been able to, Taliban hasn't been able to take over any provincial capital, let alone talk about Kabul. Yes, they have control over the countryside, but are they going to easily roll over the Afghan security forces? Is America going to just sit on the sidelines and just let the Taliban completely take over areas in Afghanistan? So I think a more likely scenario is a protracted kind of a conflict that is going to continue between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And in a conflict like this, if India has to pick sides, I think it's clear which side it should pick. And that's the side of the Afghan government. Even if we accept, that Taliban would have to become a partner in the power sharing arrangement, it's quite clear. And I think a number of speakers have said that the best way to bring in peace in the country is to have a power sharing arrangement between the Taliban and the Afghan government. How it comes about has also been suggested through Doha Agreement, etc. And certainly, we accept that there must be a power sharing arrangement, but would it be preferable to say in what the future structure of the country should look like? Would probably be a more equitable power sharing arrangement than a completely dominant Taliban. And therefore, I think the Indian government should assist the Afghan government with both military and development assistance. And I think we should clearly come out, on that side. And I think there are no issues in dealing, because we're dealing with the sovereign government of Afghanistan. So I think we should not be hesitant about it at all. Does that mean that we don't engage with Taliban? And no, I don't. The Taliban is a dominant and a major player in Afghanistan, and therefore India must engage with all the players that are there. But this engagement must be with some purpose, not an engagement based on hope. And the purpose must be that there must be peace. Taliban must shun violence. It must come to the negotiating table and come to a peaceful agreement. If that purpose is not being achieved, and the Taliban continues to do what it's doing, I don't see what is the real major purpose of our engagement with the Taliban. Hoping that Taliban will turn a new sort of ideological leaf, they will give up the idea of Islamic rule, they will shun all the terrorist groups, they will suddenly start walking the middle path between India and Pakistan. I think this is only hope. I mean, we don't see any signs of this at all, at least in the short term, that this would happen. And then for us to argue that we should engage because the other countries are engaging, I mean, the Americans are engaging for a completely different purpose. The Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians, the Pakistanis have their own interest of why they're engaging with the Taliban. And therefore, again, to say that, let's talk with them for the sake of talking, I think is not great strategy. As I said, engage, but engage for the purpose. So I think we must be realistic about, what we can and what we cannot do. Support the Afghan government, have a limited engagement with Taliban. Nobody is doubting, but But I think just depending on, let's have an engagement with Taliban based on some hope about the future, I think it's a fairly defensive strategy for India. So I will end here, Happy Moon. Thank you.
Thank you, General Hooda, for those very precise and sharp remarks. Now, finally, may I request and pass Vivek Katju to take the floor. Over to you, sir. So you're muted. You're muted.
Thank you, Happy Mon, and I must say it's a great honor and pleasure to be on this panel, and I'm especially honored and delighted that my old friend, Ambassador Rustam Shah Momand is on this panel. I do believe that he is one of the most knowledgeable persons, not only about KP, but also about Afghan affairs. I've always found him to be a person of great wisdom, apart from knowledge. So thank you. And I think it was good that you invited him. I will begin, before I make my remarks, to respond to what General Hooda said. I do appreciate his sentiment. But as a military person, I'm sure he is acutely aware of the limitations that geography poses to India to effectively assist the Afghan government, especially in meeting the military challenge of the Taliban. So when he says that it is a fond hope that the Taliban would change, I would very respectfully submit to him that it is indeed a fond hope to think that India can succeed in effecting the unfolding of events in Afghanistan, even if it wishes to extend all support to the Kabul elite. India simply doesn't have the wherewithal to do so. So let us therefore not think in grandiose terms, but think in terms of what exists on the ground. In the 1990s, and I have a little personal awareness of what was happening in the 1990s, the Russians and the Iranians, and of course we, were at that stage very, very concerned about the Taliban and what it represented. And indeed, so was the international community. But today, the situation has changed. And I'm sure my colleague and great friend Rakesh would agree with me that diplomacy demands that as things change, nations adapt. But having said that, let me start with the proposition that nation building cannot be endeavored from outside. President Biden recently said that America had not gone in for nation building, but had gone in for a specific task, which was to ensure that Afghan territory, I understood him as saying that it was to ensure that Afghan territory again never became a locus from which American interests could be harmed in the way they were harmed on 9/11. But that's not entirely true, because that may have been the principal objective. But the Americans got involved along with NATO to engage in nation building in Afghanistan. I would submit that for all nations, nation building is an indigenous exercise. It cannot take place from outside. And the Afghan structure I believe, began to be shaken up completely with the Dawood coup, and it has never recovered thereafter. So, after that came the communists, and then, of course, we know what happened thereafter. I think perhaps Rustam Saab, Happy Mon, I think Mr. Rustam
we will
wants to
come
make a comment, and should I stop for him to make a comment?
Rustam, do
Because
you want to
he's
make a
raised
comment
his hand.
now or after Ambassador Katju finishes speaking? Rustam Saab, we can't see you now. We can only see your hand. Sir, I think you should continue. We can't hear from Rustam Saab.
Okay. Okay, fine. So that structure has broken down, and it is regrettable that in the last 20 years, neither the Kabul elite led by President Karzai nor by President Ghani ever endeavored, despite all their difficulties, ever endeavored to reconcile differing visions in Afghanistan and embark on a path of true nation building. I recently wrote that one of the sadnesses that I see is that the Kabul elite hardly ever went into the Pashtun heartland to challenge the narrative of the Taliban. I know there were security concerns, but I do not know how many times President Karzai and his Pashtun colleagues in particular went between the stretch of, say, Nangarhar. I'm not going into Kunar. Between Nangarhar, across Khost, Paktiya, Paktaka, Zabul, Kandhar, Helmand, and sat down with the village elders to discuss the vision that the Republic represented and challenged the vision of the Taliban. And therefore, it is my contention that they left complete virgin territory for the Taliban to push their narrative in the Pashtun heartland. They simply didn't combat it. And today, again, Afghanistan is confronted with this task, and it's become supremely difficult, of reconciling visions. The Americans and the Europeans tried to impose a structure. I have often said that when I was ambassador there from 2002 to 2005, and I remember, it was that this particular nation building exercise, and Ambassador Momand was also there, was being undertaken in a bizarre manner, with security in the hands of the Americans, the army, the police, with the Germans, the British in charge of anti-narcotics, and for some reason which I've never understood, the Italians to work on the justice system in Afghanistan. Now, this is now how all this is done. And today, again, neither the Western powers, nor Iran, Central Asian, Russians, Chinese, or Pakistan can do this task for the Afghans. And it's become more complicated because of the reasons that were mentioned by Happy Mon right at the beginning, the changing demographics in Afghanistan. But till that is done, and it can only be done by the Afghans, I'm afraid Afghanistan will not be at peace, and individual powers will naturally dabble in Afghanistan in different ways to seek their own interests. Pakistan will do so, India will do so, so will China, so will others. So the onus, to my mind, rests with our Afghan friends. And we can talk till the cows come home, but this simply can't be done by outsiders. Now, it's all very well to say that there is outside interference in Afghanistan, but of course there is. And it will be till the Afghans themselves come together and decide to change their own course of history. There is the burden of history which is heavy on Afghanistan. There has to be reconciliation in different ways, including ethnic reconciliation. I know that the Pashtuns don't like hearing this, but it is a fact that there has to be true accommodation of Tajik, Uzbek, and even Hazara interests. Ambassador Momen said this, that the Taliban are now more willing to have a more inclusive system, but I'm not sure whether they are really willing to give up what I was told once by a Pakistani Pashtun diplomat who told me, he says, you know, the land between the Indus and the Amu Darya is Pashtun land. I don't know if that thinking is changed. So I am pessimistic today. I am pessimistic because I don't see that there is, you know, an animation in Afghan minds and hearts that they've got to come together to reconcile. And if that begins, that process begins, despite all the difficulties, then we can see a glimmer of hope. Till then, and this is my last point, till then, I think different countries will seek their different interests. And to secure Indian interests, I've advocated from 2017 that India has to talk to the Taliban. It doesn't mean endorsing their ideologies, but it has to talk to the Taliban, and we can support the Afghan government, and we should. We have, after all, a strategic partnership agreement. But I do not see how we can ever overcome the challenge of geography, because the old configuration of the 1990s simply doesn't exist. And General Hooda will forgive me, but we should have no exaggerated ideas about our capacities to influence events in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Katju Saab. I know Rustum Saab and Tamim Saab have both raised their hands. What I will do is that I'll sort of pose two questions and request all of you to sort of respond to these two questions. But I'll start with Rustum Saab and then to Tamim and the others. I think it is important to ask two fundamental questions. One, and Rustum Saab did sort of refer to some of these issues. Are the Taliban changed a lot today on key fundamental issues such as political accommodation, pluralism in Afghanistan, girls' education, as far as employment for women are concerned? On these issues, are the Taliban changed a lot, number one? Secondly, what is the state of the Pak-Taliban relationship? Unlike in the 1990s, are we looking at a Taliban which is perhaps trying to hedge its bets to some extent? And if that is the case, perhaps we have an entry point, at least from an Indian point of view. But I sort of agree with Ambassador Katju on that. The second question really is the role of China. We have had some of our panelists mention the issue of China, but I think China is key to what is probably going to happen in Afghanistan in the days to come. Will the Chinese presence, the presence in Afghanistan in terms of its investments there, in terms of China's engagement of the Ghani regime, and also some of the Taliban leadership, will China be able to bring about a certain amount of stability in Afghanistan, which perhaps the Soviet Union and perhaps the United States probably could not manage to do. Now, these are two open questions right there. I will start with Rustum Saab. He can answer these questions, and if there are other questions too, and then do Tamim and Tamanna, and then we'll go in that order. Rustum Saab, over to you.
I think we
yes, still connecting your
connecting
audio, sir.
No.
We still can't hear you, Rustum Saab. So while you figure that out, may I go to Tamim and request him to sort of respond to these questions. Also, Tamim, also there was a suggestion that it is important to perhaps have a lawyer jirga in Afghanistan at this point of time, and sort of trying to put together a government that is approved by the lawyer jirga. Where do you stand on that? So if you could answer these questions, and we will try and go back to Rustum Saab.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I went out a bit because of some technical problems, but I wanted to make a couple of points clear. The first is the Afghan agency. The onus of history is on Afghans. Afghans should do this, Afghans should do that. The fact of the matter is this is a multi-layered war with foreign brains, Afghan hands. We have foreign sponsors for this war and Afghan fighters. So no matter how much you would like to tell Afghans to do this and that, there is a big portion of this war which is run by outsiders. I've always maintained, and I said, that if this was an Afghan civil war, we would have had peace long time ago, maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And I think that is the fundamental issue that a lot of us ignore. The proxy aspect of this war, be it from various, from Pakistan, from Iran, and from other sponsors of this war. There is also the criminal economy aspects of this war, that the criminal economy networks does not want peace in Afghanistan. So I beg to differ, and I've been to dozens of meetings where lots of prescriptions are given that Afghans should do this, call Loya Jirga, early election, talk more to Pashtuns, ethnic reconciliation, so on and so forth. Yes, we can do that. But if the foreign hands and the foreign brains leave us alone, it is the answer I have got. So we are putting a lot of emphasis on Afghan agency where in fact it is missing. It is not there. If this was our war, if this was an Afghan war, a civil war, we would have had peace long time ago. And when the Afghans are left alone without their sponsors, they come to conclusion and they come to reconciliation, by the way, really fast. The Hizb Islami Gulbuddin Hekmatyar deal is a big example of it. And I was there in the National Security Council when we were having those secret negotiations. Because the Pakistanis simply told Hekmatyar to go back to Kabul. It was simple. And I have got dozens of other examples. Between 1980s and 2000, more than 26 different pieces of agreement or sessions were held in Tashkent, in Tajikistan, in Medina, in Mecca. Because of the simple, and that research is there at the Afghan Institute of Strategic Studies website, you can have a look, that when peace was left to Afghans, Afghans figure it out. As long as the foreign sponsors and the foreign brains and the foreign enablers leave that. Now, I don't want to sound like one of those Afghans who blame everything on foreigners. Yes, there is some blame to be shared by the Afghans too. But then the war is costly. And when you wage a war, and with poor economy like Afghanistan, I can assure you that none of these groups can be able to wage a war for a week. They cannot sustain themselves. It's as simple. So Afghan agency, yes, Afghans should do a lot of things, but then also our regional friends need to do a lot of things to ensure that the war does not continue. Now, in terms of Taliban 2.0, have Taliban changed? I've written a big piece on this matter a long time ago at the Atlantic Council. When you look at an organization like Taliban and you ask yourself a question whether they have changed, you look at 5 factors. Have their ideology changed? Factor number 1, no. They have not only changed their ideology, they have actually become more extremist in their ideology, because they believe that this ideology is the savior of Afghanistan. Second, their structure and organization. Have they changed their emir? Is there an emir system anymore, or other mechanisms? No, they have not changed their organization structure. There is still an emir in charge, and there's still other commissions that they used to have and still have it. They have basically recontextualized it into a post-2001 context. They literally consider themselves as government in exile. The third element is, of course, the finances. Taliban was financed by Al-Qaeda, international terrorist groups, regional terrorist groups, as well as the drug economy. To this day, they are being financed by that same thing. Their sources of finance, as well as the Gulf, zakat and the money that used to come from the Gulf. Their fighters, have they changed their ideology? No, they are still the same. Have they broken their ties with foreign and regional terrorist groups? 1/3 of Taliban fighting machinery are Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, Ansarullah of Tajikistan, all sorts of global and international terrorists. And they have not cut ties. We heard from the Taliban, a spokesperson the other day, who said that we have given assurances to the US that these fighters, our brothers, will not use our soil to attack them, but we have not given them assurances that we will cut ties. That was not the commitment that we gave. So in my humble opinion, and I've written extensively on this particular topic, Taliban not only have changed, they have not only changed, but they have actually become more adamant and more arrogant. And they think that they have prevailed. And why not? I mean, why they should change if they think they have prevailed and victory is in sight? In terms of the social peace, the ethnic reconciliation and other things, look, every country has those ethnic problems of different sects, of different, the diversity that is there. To term this war as an ethnic war is a disservice to Afghanistan. You can put the same thing on Pakistanis, Punjabis versus Sindhis, and Sindhis versus Pashtuns, Muhajirs. You can say the same thing about India. The Gujaratis versus this, the Jains versus Hindus. In US, the Spanish against, Spanish speaking against the Mexicans, and the Irish against others, the New Yorkers against Californians. I mean, all the problems that you have. That is not the way to go about it. It's our diversity and it's our pluralism, and we should accept that. Yes, we have issues, but that's not the driver of this war. That is not the main driver of this war. We need a social reconciliation that has to go. In terms of Pakistani-Taliban relationship, it has been elevated right now. I think previously, Admiral Mike Mullen called Haqqani network as the veritable arm of the Pakistani army. I would call now Taliban, the entire Taliban, as veritable arm of the Pakistani establishment, and that is well-established fact now. I mean, even the Pakistani establishment in our negotiations with our officials no longer deny that. They actually say, well, it's an asset, you have to find a way to deal with them, and we can help influence that. So it's no more a covert thing. It's an overt thing. They accept it. They just say, we can help you come to some sort of a settlement with them, and we have influence, we have control. So it's no more a secret. Whether they have cut ties, no. The relationship, I think, is now maybe 2.0, an elevated and a more strengthened relationship and more overt, moving from the covert side. On Chinese relationship with the Taliban and Ghani administration, they have had, I must say, a very cautious approach to Taliban and Ghani administration. They, of course, recognize the Ghani administration as the official state. and they deal with it, and they encourage Taliban through the Pakistani channels, as well as through direct covert channels to bring stability and make some room for some sort of political settlement. And you heard Foreign Minister of China making 3 points when it comes to their priorities to Afghanistan. The first priority that the Chinese declared, I think a week ago, when it comes to Afghanistan, is to prevent descent into chaos, a civil war. So they don't want a civil war. The second, he pronounced that their priority is that the Afghan soil will not be used against Chinese projects and so on and so forth. And the third is, of course, they would like to help in the political settlement and give whatever they can to ensure that that political settlement and reconciliation comes. Can China stabilize Afghanistan? No, they have no appetite, no interest. For them, it's a narrow national security and some economic issues. But effectively, they're very worried that if Afghanistan descends into chaos, their Western corridor as a part of their BRI initiative, which goes through Central Asia, as well as the CPEC, will be influenced because of the spillover effects. And we already see that certain parts of the Balochistan and other areas are becoming insecure, and that is, I would say, directly related to the withdrawal and the vacuum that the US and NATO are leaving, and to the instability in Afghanistan. So the Chinese have no appetite and no interest, direct interest, to replace US or NATO. There is no alternative for US and NATO, and there won't be, and nobody has the resources in the region to do that. I think what they can do effectively, China and others, is to join hands and agree on a minimum set of national security and economic interests and ensure that there is a political settlement. Otherwise, of course, there will be problems.
Thank you, Mr. Asey. Rustum Saab, let me come to you now. Tamim Saab has made it very clear that he does not think there is any change as far as Taliban 2.0 is concerned, nor does he think that the terror links that the Taliban has had, be it LET, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Al-Qaeda, none of that has been ruptured. So where do you stand on these two questions? One, has the Taliban really changed? You seem to make that argument, of course. And secondly, what is the state of relationship between Pakistani deep state and the Taliban? And thirdly, the China question. There is also a question from Rana Banerjee to you on the issue of whether if a lawyer Jirga were to be held, would the Taliban leadership listen to it? How would they control their local commanders to respect the rights of women, not molest young women or widows? And how will discipline be enforced? Over to you, Rustum Saab.
Well, I'm sorry I didn't catch anything of Ambassador Katju's presentation. I was cut off, and I began to listen only, began to hear what was being said only 3 or 4 minutes ago. So first of all, I think let's not close our eyes to some of the fundamental realities. Who helped in the destruction of the Taliban government in 2001? Pakistan. Which country handed over 600 Taliban supporters to the Americans for them to be sent to Guantanamo Bay? It was Pakistan. Which country arrested Afghanistan's Taliban's ambassador and handed him over to the Americans? It was Pakistani government. Who arrested Mullah Birada and kept him in jail for 8 years? The current leader of the negotiation team in Doha. Pakistani government arrested. Have the Taliban forgotten or forgiven? Never. Taliban or the Afghans don't forget and don't forgive. The problem is some of their leaders are still residing in Balochistan in Pakistan with their families. So Pakistan has influence, but Pakistan does not control Taliban. Even when they were in government, when they were planning to destroy the Bamiyan Buddhas, the Pakistani interior minister went to Kabul and made an earnest plea to stop them from destroying the Buddhas, the Bamiyan Buddhas. But they said no. let me tell you that when their core interests are concerned, when their strategic interests are concerned, Taliban take their own decision. And let me also tell you that if and when the Taliban take control of the country, and those of the leaders' families who currently reside in Balochistan, they also go back, they go across into Afghanistan, they would become more, of course, more independent and more assertive in conducting their internal and foreign policies. I do not believe the Taliban have any connection whatsoever with organizations like Al-Qaeda anymore. Al-Qaeda, in my view, from my own experience and my knowledge of the area, does no longer exist in Afghanistan. Daesh exists. Daesh has come into Afghanistan under the American watch. It was never there before. Turkestan Islamic Movement, Uzbekistan Islamic Movement, Fidai Mahaz. These are the four brutal outfits that still exist, and they carry out attacks on government installations from time to time, particularly in eastern Afghanistan and Kabul, the capital Kabul. And as I said before, that the neighboring countries believe that only a Taliban-led government can defeat and eliminate these outfits. As far as the decisions of the Loy Jirga are concerned, Taliban will be bound to accept. I think not accepting the decisions of the Loy Jirga would be completely repudiating the collective will of the people of Afghanistan that the Taliban would not be able to afford. I don't think that is going to happen at all. Never in the history of Afghanistan in the last 300 years have anyone declined to accept the verdict, the decisions of the Loy Jirga. And I think that practice is going to continue. In any case, the Loy Jirga will be convened in consultation with the Taliban after taking their views, and if they would see in the convening of the Loy Jirga, they would see the best possible chance for them to assume control of their country along with other factions and parties. Rashid Dostum, the Uzbek warlord, for instance, is opposed to the Taliban, but his son Batur Dostum is having contacts with Taliban. Ustad Atta Muhammad Noor, the ruler of northern Afghanistan in Balkh province in Mazar-e Sharif, has contacts with Taliban. Karim Khalili of Hizb Wahadat has contacts with Taliban. Other factions also have contacts with Taliban, some secretly, some openly. Why the Afghan army has been surrendering district after district? Because they see that this situation is going to alter very soon, and they see the coming of the Taliban as being inevitable in the circumstances now, in circumstances in which Afghanistan finds itself. So that is the reason, because of despair, despondency, or hopelessness, or their belief that this dispensation is now going to end and is going to be replaced, they are having contacts and they surrendered peacefully and they were allowed to go home. Of course, the stuff that they delivered is being used by the Taliban, and the Taliban revenue comes, let me tell you also, the Taliban revenue comes from the areas that have been under their control for many years now, because they collect taxes. Let me tell you also that even in the predominantly Taliban controlled area in the past, even the American convoys had to pay taxes. The Afghan military convoys had to pay taxes to the Taliban. So the Taliban are not dependent on any external source for revenue. I think they internally generate enough revenue. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is their unwillingness to accept a ceasefire proposal. Now, let's try to understand. The Taliban are a ragtag volunteers. They are not a disciplined force. Everybody goes to fight for the Taliban for 2 months from a certain village. When he comes back, his cousin, brother, or somebody from his family or clan goes to take his place. That is how the Taliban volunteers fight. If there is a ceasefire for a longer period, 1 month or 2 months, and these people all go home, the Taliban believe that if the ceasefire does not deliver, it will be impossible for them to call their volunteers back and to ask them to fight again. That doesn't happen in an insurgency. So they believe that the ceasefire is a trap, because with the ceasefire being effective, the Taliban movement would lose its relevance, its steam gradually, and it would begin to disappear. So that is the reason that Taliban would not accept ceasefire unless there is something very solid, substantive on the table. That is as far as the. Was there any other question for me?
There was a quick question about whether you could throw more light on why Pakistan sheltered Osama bin Laden for so many years. But sir, be very quick with that, and then we'll move on to Tamanna.
My own information is that Osama bin Laden, his presence was never in the knowledge of the Pakistani authorities. The Americans discovered his presence, and they of course raided his bombed his house and arrested him, and that was a big surprise and a very big shock for the Pakistani officials. But beyond that, I don't know much about how Osama bin Laden was smuggled into Abbottabad by his colleagues, and he was kept there for such a long time without being discovered by the Pakistani government departments.
Thank you, sir. Tamanna, over to you. To the two questions that I asked in the beginning, may I add one more question for you? And that is, there has been a lot of talk in the recent past about the continued American presence in the region, particularly, the possible use of Pakistani air bases or other places for its access to Afghanistan. If you could also throw some light on that.
Sure. I will very briefly touch on, I think both the speakers have touched quite a bit on this. On the Taliban nature, I would re-emphasize that I think we're setting up a false dichotomy here, right? That somehow the Afghan government is great to women and great to minorities, and the Taliban is like this evil entity. Life for women and minorities in Afghanistan has improved over the 20 years, right? I agree with that. I think definitely you see that it is much more open, but it is not great. I mean, even there are warlords in other rural areas where being an Afghan woman is not easy. It is difficult for them. And even the laws, there are good laws that protect Afghan women. They are not implemented, right? So I think we have to be very clear on that you're not picking between a good future for women and a bad future for women. That being said, I would say Afghan women have agency. The Afghan women have been some of the strongest negotiators. They are the ones who have stood up for interpretations of Islam and not said that, oh, what the Taliban says is Islam. So I would not portray the Afghan women as just victims in this process, right? We need an inclusive peace process. A political settlement must include the voices of the Afghan women who know what they're talking about, right? Like, we can all sit here and talk about their future, but they are the ones who actually have agency and knowing what they need. That being said, I think, as General Hooda said, you can't talk to the Taliban expecting that they have changed or that they will be some sort of progressive movement. I don't think that's the case, nor are many other factions in Afghanistan. For example, we raised General Dostum and others. These are not progressive Democrats, right, that we're talking about. And that's why what is in the interest, I would argue, is not seeing, has the Taliban now allowed women to go to school? You can argue where they're progressive. I would say the Taliban is not a monolith. There's political leaders in the Taliban who may be more lenient on some social order. There are others in the field, definitely military commanders, who are just as regressive. But the main point is politically, they are still pushing an emirate. They have not backed away from an emirate, right? Leave all the, where women go to school or don't go to school. Ultimately, they want an emirate. And that's why I would argue the interest is finding a way to get them in a political settlement that includes representatives of different Afghan factions, right? Women are not looking to the Taliban to be their representatives. Allow other political leaders to be in that settlement. And from that, I want to move into something that Tamim raised, which I think is a very important point. The nature of Afghan politics when left to Afghans, they are used to making political agreements with their once foes. The Afghan history is full of that once a group is defeated, they make an agreement. And even the Taliban in 2002, 2003, when they believed they were defeated, was willing to make a deal. They understood that they had been defeated, and in places they were willing to accept, they were sent to Guantanamo or they were not included in bond. These are all their complaints of that time. But I think it is important to realize that nobody goes into a loya jirga, and let alone a constitutional loya jirga, without those political conversations having been had first. You don't go into a loya jirga blind. Nobody calls a loya jirga without knowing what the end result will be. The Afghans are very politically adept at this. They negotiate beforehand so they know what the likely result will be. And so I think that we have to support that Afghan political process. But as Tamim said, there is enough regional and international putting fingers on the scale that this isn't a purely Afghan process. And so I think we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that it is. Very quickly on China, the US tried to work with China a lot. At Murray, Chinese were there in so many dialogues. Afghanistan to us was one point of convergence between the US and China, but I think China is not willing to go much beyond and exert a lot of proactive measures in Afghanistan. So I wouldn't count on the Chinese to solve or secure Afghanistan. On the war economy, I think this is another very significant point. A lot of this, what we think of as militants, there's a whole war economy that everyone depends on, and shifting that to a peace economy will require a lot of work. It's not something that happens overnight. And in terms of Taliban changing, where they have changed is they have diversified their monetary sources. They are quite well funded, but it is not just one source. It's drugs, it's mining, taxes, extortion, but also charitable donations from overseas, exports. They have real estate and business investments outside of Afghanistan. So you have now got a Taliban that is more economically savvy in the sense that they are funded across so many different, they don't even need money from, certain places because they have such a diversity of income. You raised the Pakistan relationship. I would argue that the relationship is a love-hate relationship. They need each other, they work together, they don't like each other. And we saw this very much whenever we tried to negotiate and get Pakistani help. The Taliban dislikes Pakistan and dislikes its treatment by Pakistan. That being said, they see the instrumentality of working with Pakistan. There are parts of the Taliban, like the Haqqanis, who are much closer to Pakistan and work much better with Pakistan. And there are parts that chafe under, their families have not been treated well or they've been imprisoned, so they don't like Pakistan. I think as the Taliban moves outside of Pakistan, the leverage is less. I don't think we can find any instances where the Pakistanis have been able to convince the Taliban to do anything that the Taliban didn't want to do already, right? So in the end, when it comes to us, they can bring them to the negotiating table. They actually can't force the Taliban to come to a decision. So we have to be clear-eyed about how much, unlike some other groups, I think the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani government, they have a marriage of convenience, but not necessarily one where they always get along. You asked about bases. I think a lot of that is just media hype. There is no basing. The US is not looking at basing in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, and the Pakistanis are not going to accept basing, right? I think it has to be sub that level. There are counterterrorism, cooperation things that we can do that are short of basing. And I think Pakistan is one place, but I don't think you're gonna get the same type of deals that you saw in the last 20 years. The money just isn't there. in the United States, there's a lot of just rancor and, just the history of distrust with US and Pakistan relations over the last 20 years. I think the US is looking towards Central Asia and other places where they might be able to accomplish some of their counterterrorism goals.
Tamanna, may now come to Ambassador Rakesh. Sood, please. Ambassador Sood, if you could also sort of be a little more forthright on what should be India's policy towards the Taliban. I mean, Ambassador Katju has been pretty forthright on open talks with the Taliban. Where do you stand on that, apart from the other issues, of course, that you'd like to throw light on?
Sure. I think on your first question, if the Taliban have changed, I don't think I'll add anything to what Tamim said. The Taliban have not changed, if anything, and therefore I would disagree with your article this morning, Happy Mon, of the 2.0. I think it is still very much 1.0, except that they've become smarter as 1.0. So, they now handle all these investments that Tamanna was talking about. They know how to make fools out of willing idiots. We have many of those around. So there are plenty of those, and we won't get into names of willing idiots, or useful idiots, as the phrase was when Lenin used it for certain people. So, but I don't think they have changed at all. They use social media. They handle all of that much more effectively. And if they've changed, but in terms of ideology, no, they haven't changed. I am, Tamim said, and I normally agree with a lot of what he says, but he said that, if the Afghans left to themselves, but then it is true. But then what happens normally with the Afghans is, as history tells us, is not that they do deals. They don't do compromises. What they do is, once, there are winners and losers. Compromises are normally not, the give and take has already taken place on the battlefield. As I think Tamanna is right in that when she says that once a group is defeated, yes. So essentially that is what you are seeing, therefore. And so if we are looking at that kind of an outcome, and if, I don't know if Tamanna really implied that we are going to see a military victory of the Taliban. But yes, the reality is that once a group is defeated and then you have a loya jirga and then they accept it. So but that is not the outcome that we are looking for. We are looking for something better. And but I wouldn't agree with Tamanna when she says that, women and minorities, well, they've had a bad deal here and they've had a bad deal there. So what is there to choose from? I don't think that's, I think there is, yes, but at least they have progressive laws. And today you don't have any assurance whether the progressive laws that we have regarding women and minorities are going to be retained by the Taliban. I think that is where I would strongly say that I differ with the fact that, yes, you have a real choice. The US has one major power, and I think this is where the test of Pakistan's influence on the Taliban will come in, which is that the US, even if it moves away from there, the US is able to give or withdraw legitimacy because of the fact that it is a major financial donor, because of the fact that it's a permanent member of the Security Council, because of the fact that it has influence with the European Union and NATO and all of that. So let us say if tomorrow the Taliban go back to some, ways that they had adopted in the 1990s, the US will then start the process of this sanctions and this and that, and and a delegitimization process. And I think the Pakistanis understand that very well. And to that extent, the Pakistanis, and that is where the test of Pakistan's influence will come in. But unfortunately, by the time we get to that stage, Afghanistan would already be under pretty much Taliban control. And what we are talking about is, so in a sense, the situation would have been aggravated far, far more before we come to that stage. And I think today, if you see the influence, you know, the Taliban delegation in Tehran or in Moscow, and you see this thing saying that we don't, they are now reviving the last year's General Security Council resolution, saying we don't support a return to the Islamic Emirate. Islamic Emirate is just a label for what the Taliban was earlier. But so far, we have not seen the sign of, you know, pragmatism, which Ambassador Rustam Shah Memon said. He said Taliban have become pragmatic. I don't think we have seen any signs of pragmatism. Yes, they have become more adept, but not pragmatic. Regarding, I'll come to the last point about what you said about India's options. You know, like Vivek, I have also for a long time suggested that we should have established linkages and opened up connections with the Taliban. We can try and do that today. Maybe we are doing it, maybe we are not doing it, but you know, you don't learn how to swim by jumping into a river when the river is in flood. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Sood. General Hooda, let me come to you next. You know, there seems to be, although you didn't speak at length, there seems to be a lot of agreement on the table with what you said. Mr. Asey and even Ambassador Sood seem to agree with you. So I mean, apart from the other questions, I have a very specific question for you, and that is about the impact of Taliban's return to power in one way or the other in Afghanistan on Kashmir. Now, I don't mean fighters coming to Kashmir. I mean, you know, in a psychological sense of the term, will the youngsters in Kashmir be more emboldened to take up arms against the Indian state should the Taliban succeed in Afghanistan? I think if you could throw some light on that, I'd be grateful. Over to you.
Hi, Happy Man, was that question for me?
That was a question for you, sir.
Okay, sorry, I just lost you. Okay, so just before that, you know, just a little response to what Ambassador Katju said. See, I understand there are geographical limits. There are limits to how we can apply Indian influence in Afghanistan. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt about that. But does that mean that we don't have our own interests? I think it's clear our interest is that the Taliban must not be allowed to grab power by force. Because if they do that and they become a dominant force in Afghan governance, it's not good for India. It's not even good for, I think, the Afghan people. Mr. Tamim has said, I mean, whatever you can say about Taliban 2.0, I mean, the ideology remains just the same. Now, I'm also conscious that we may not succeed in what we are doing because of the limits that we have. But does that mean we should not even try? Should we not even try and strengthen the Afghan government in their fight against the Taliban? I mean, today we are calling ourselves a regional power. We are calling ourselves, we are great. Even in our neighborhood, if we say, sorry, we have absolutely no way to influence events. I think it's just a matter of will. I understand there are limitations, there are geographical limitations, but it's also a matter of will. Now, and the fact is, if Taliban gets empowered, again, as Mr. Tamim has pointed out, whom are you empowering? I mean, Taliban also has Lashkar fighters, Jaish fighters. And that comes to, you know, your question of what will happen in Kashmir. Frankly, Happymon, between 1990, when the situation blew up in Kashmir, and we saw Afghan fighters, and we saw some people coming from that side. As far as the border management is considered, the situation has improved tremendously. So I don't see a physical move of fighters. But yes, a Taliban victory is going to provide a morale booster for the youth in the valley. I mean, we are already seeing a change in trends in Kashmir, where initially the ideology used to be sort of independence or autonomy from India, you're seeing an Islamic ideology more and more in Kashmir. And so if you have another victory of the Taliban, having defeated another superpower, I'm sure it is going to, at least have a morale boosting factor in Kashmir. So again, as I say, it's in our interest to make sure that it doesn't happen. Whatever be the limits of our influence, we must at least attempt to reach those limits.
Thank you, General Hooda. Ambassador Katju, the final word to you. There is also, I mean, apart from the other questions, there is also a question in the chat box for you, and that is India very late in recognizing the Afghanistan crisis, and why is India showing hesitancy in establishing direct dialogue talks with the Taliban? Over to you, Ambassador Katju. So you are muted.
Of course, India is very late. I've been arguing since 2017 that we should openly have links with the Taliban, while at the same time maintaining our strategic partnership with Kabul. That is how this diplomatic game is played. And we should have played it. Now, a couple of points. First, if the Americans, the world's preeminent power, after 20 years has had to suffer a strategic defeat, then it seems to me that we can try, but will we succeed? And I, for one, like to weigh my options very, very closely before I venture. So it's not a question of will, it's a question of capacity. Second, I didn't mean to offend my Afghan friends. Of course, there is enormous interference from the international community and the regional powers. But I do believe that the Afghans, as a people, have a history of independent thought and action and a sure instinct for their interests like no other people. And they have demonstrated this all through history. In the 19th century, the British experienced that. In the 20th century, it was the Soviets. And in the 21st century, it is the Americans who have suffered a strategic defeat. Now, an external power has helped the Taliban. Pakistan has done everything in its capacity to help the Taliban. But let's not be mistaken. The Taliban have independent agency, as do my other Afghan friends. And I use the word friends deliberately. For I have very, very personal, dear friendships in Afghanistan, which I value very much. So it saddens me when I say that there was no attempt at a reconciliation, no attempt really at reaching out, especially in the Pashtun heartland, and sitting down with people and clarifying things. I will share something with you. In 2002, in the summer of 2002, I was surprised that I was the first person from Kabul, an ambassador, who went into Paktika coast. My Pakistani friends were most upset, but I had gone there just because I wanted to know what is the situation on the ground. So that is what I'm submitting. Now, I do believe that there is an enormous difference in visions. Now, I must confess, I do not have a full understanding of how, if the Taliban have changed or if they've not changed. I hear colleagues say colleagues on the panel say that they've not changed. Let us assume that they've not changed. The question is, what can you do about their not changing? The Americans have lost. They couldn't change them. So one has to accept ground reality. But I do believe that the Taliban too realize that the emirate of the 1990s cannot be accepted, cannot be resurrected. They are aware that they want, if they wish, full legitimacy, then they will have to accept a modicum of international norms on gender issues, on minority rights, etc. And when it comes to these matters, the international community accepts a very, very wide variation, whatever it may say of universal rights. This is the reality, and we know this. And my last point, I know the hour is getting late. My last point is that any country which, for whatsoever reason, ideological, theological, domestic politics, fails to act according to how the chessboard is laid out, pays a very heavy price. And I don't think India should pay that price. And strategy is not made through pious platitudes or aspirations voiced, but it is pursued through concrete actions and deft diplomatic maneuvering, accepting pragmatism and realism as guides. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Katju. I think that is an excellent note to end this discussion about the need for pragmatism and realism. But I think at the end of this 2-hour-long discussion, what is clear is that there is no good news as far as Afghanistan is concerned. We are looking at a looming civil war, perhaps, and the.
Can I make a quick intervention?
Please, please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I put the request there for you, but I think you didn't see it. Just quickly on a few things that Tamanna raised, as well as others, quickly. Look, I understand transforming the Taliban from a military force to a political force, but whitewashing them would not help you. I am sitting here and I can tell you with a lot of confidence, because our sources in provinces, specifically in Daikundi and in Malistan, in Ghazni, the Taliban are committing, and in Spinboldak as we speak, by the way, are committing war crimes. Their views of women haven't changed. They have actually put out a rule, what they call ethics rule, a written ethics rule for women to stay at home, don't go out without anybody, any male companion, so on and so forth. In Patua of Daikundi, they have thrown babies to boiling water. They have followed the scorched earth policy. And they have asked the Hazara and Shiite minorities to pay them taxes. And in some cases, they've killed all the fighting age male in those particular. As we speak in Badakhshan and Kunduz, Taliban have asked from the communities list of ladies between 14 to 40 for marriage, which is jihadun nikah. So these are ground realities. I'm not making it up. It's there. UN is now investigating a lot of these things. I understand the United States is leaving and others have left, but whitewashing the Taliban and legitimizing them on your way out as a political force is not the way out. Let's call them for what they are and who they are. I've lived during the Taliban in the 1990s. As a single mother's son, I know how they treat women. I know how they treat minorities. In fact, they're treating minorities now worse than they used to treat in the 1990s. And UN and others are now investigating their human rights division, UNAMA, as we speak. In terms of Indian position, India, of course, is a country, it can decide itself, but you saw Taliban's statement saying that India should prove its neutrality before we engage with them. And India should seek forgiveness for its past assistance. Do you want to do that? I mean, Dr. Jaishankar, is he willing to go to Qatar and Doha and seek forgiveness for India's past assistance to Afghan state, or prove India is neutral in Afghanistan? I think that's for Indians to decide. But that is Taliban position. You are talking about pragmatism, about realpolitik. I'm putting some realpolitik in front of you to make a decision on that. In terms of reaching out to Pashtun's heartland, from 2007, there were reach outs. Hamid Karzai lost his relationship with the Americans over the peace process. Since 2007, in fact, in 2003, when the Taliban handed over a letter to Hamid Karzai and said, we are handing over the government to you, it was Donald Rumsfeld. Karzai was pushing for it. It was Zalmay Khalilzad and Donald Rumsfeld who refused a settlement, calling them. That's history. But since 2007, President Karzai has had a systematic reach out to the Taliban, as well as to the Pashtun heartland, by the way, as we were speaking. That has been there. The problem has always been the proxy element of this war. The brains of this war is somewhere else, and that is that's what the point I always make, and that's the problem that all Afghans have. And as I said, when Afghans are left for themselves, we have to be, we will be able to reach this political settlement. We have to cut the brains and the sponsors of this war out of this war so to be able to reach a political settlement.
Thank you, Tamim. I'll give 30 seconds each to Ambassador Katju and Ambassador Rakesh Sood. Ambassador Rakesh Sood, please go first, and please take 30 seconds if you have any points to make.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that there was a comment made about, unfortunately, Ambassador Momand has left us, but I just wanted to say something. He made the comment about how many Taliban Pakistan has handed over to the Americans, etc., etc. And in that context, he also said that Pakistan imprisoned Mullah Brother for 8 years. Let me say this, that Mullah Brother was imprisoned in a highly ambiguous kind of an operation. In fact, President Karzai was livid when he heard, because President Karzai was in touch with the Taliban, as in fact, but he was doing it minus the ISI. He did not want the ISI. He didn't want to go through the ISI. Once the ISI heard, they came to know that Mullah Brother was a conduit, and Mullah Brother had, incidentally, Mullah Umar's blessings for it. They made a fool out of the US, the CIA, told them that they had the number 2 of the Taliban in their sights, did a joint operation, took Mullah Brother into custody, and eventually it led to enormous amount of negotiation till about 4 years later, Salahuddin Rabbani, who at that time was the chief of the High Peace Council, was able to get a sight of Mullah Brother. And the reason was because Mullah Brother is a Popal's eye, as President Karzai is. And so they had certain tribal linkages. So, and eventually, of course, the Pakistanis very generously provided Mullah Brother out in 2018 to Ambassador Khalilzad by pointing out that, all right, we'll now let him go, and so that there is a senior face of the Taliban available to discuss things with you in Doha. So I just wanted to lay that out as a part of history. Thank you.
Katju sir, 30 seconds.
The information given by our colleague Tamim is most about Taliban actions is most disturbing. The UNAMA, he says, is investigating, and should UNAMA report this to the United Nations, then I'm fully confident that the international community will take action against the Taliban and ask the Taliban leadership to identify those who are doing this. Should it be traced to the Taliban leadership, then of course the situation would change. It is not acceptable that babies should be thrown into boiling water. That goes without question. But my question to our colleague Tamim is this. If this is the situation, why is not the why is it not that the Afghan government is breaking talks? Why did Dr. Abdullah go to Doha? So I find it a little strange that my Afghan friends should tell me on the one hand that don't go and talk to the Taliban, and then themselves lead delegations led by the chairman of the National Reconciliation Committee himself to talk to Mullah Baradar at a time when the Taliban are throwing babies into boiling water. So this dichotomy is something that I think India needs to be conscious of. And if the Taliban are making comments that they want India to rub their nose in the ground, then certainly no Indian would ever accept that kind of conditions. And the Taliban would themselves realize that these conditions are not the conditions which are expressed to countries like India. But at the same time, I think, Happy Mon, you for one and others, and I'm letting out no secret, know full well that the Taliban themselves reached out to India and told us that don't take us to be Pakistani proxies. We are Afghans. So I'm mindful of that fact too. So I, for one, have had long years in diplomacy, and I don't take emotional statements like, let India do this and let India do that very seriously. And certainly that doesn't deter diplomatic investigation and diplomatic action. That is the lessons that all professional diplomats learn and act upon. Thank you.
Thank you, Katju Sahab. I think we have now come to the end of this very, very vibrant discussion. I mean, clearly, Tamim Sahab, we really understand that you are an Afghan and you're living in Afghanistan. We certainly understand your sentiments and the viewpoints. We completely empathize with the arguments that you have made. But I think, as Katju Sahab said, that we are sitting in India, we are in the neighborhood, and we have had certain experience in the past with the Taliban. So there is no simple solution as far as we are concerned. There is no simple strategy as far as we are concerned. I think it's a complicated situation even for us. But I think the question that we are asking ourselves is whether there is a way that India can perhaps get into a negotiation with the Taliban. And as Tamanna also pointed out, I mean, as far as we are concerned, the most important question is what is the nature of the relationship between the Pakistani deep state and the Taliban. Now, I think there is a lot of clarity today that it is more complicated than perhaps it was earlier. As Tamanna pointed out, the Taliban perhaps used them for instrumental purposes, but it's not entirely as if the Taliban is a handmaiden of the Pakistanis as it were. And as far as the human rights situation is concerned, clearly, as Ambassador Katju also pointed out, these are really, I mean, in any of these human rights violations should be condemned. There's little doubt about that. But the question is, the Taliban has also been giving assurances from time to time that we have taken it upon ourselves to sort of respect the rights of women, of women going to girl children going to school, etc. Tamanna also pointed out that she has had the personal experience of talking to children of daughters of Taliban leaders who have been attending school. So it is not really a black and white situation as it were. And I think the related point really that has come across in this come out in this conversation is that Taliban is not really a monolith. Don't view the Taliban only as an ideological group. It is a political group. It has evolved over time, and perhaps the international community probably needs to, certainly India, being where it is and having had the experience that we have had, we need to look at the Taliban with a lot more, I think, sophistication, as it were. Now, we are not really doubting or questioning the Afghan agency, and I think Tamim has put that across very, very clearly, that it is the proxy wars that get played out in Afghanistan that has gotten Afghanistan where it is today. So those proxy wars need to stop. I think in that context, therefore, the question to ask at this point of time, and what we need to look forward to is what is perhaps going to happen as far as the coordination among China, Russia, and Pakistan is concerned in the Afghan geopolitical landscape. I think this is a developing story. We simply don't have an answer at this point of time to that. But as I said, this is an issue that is of great strategic significance to India and importance to India. This is a story we are going to follow, and CSDR will continue to engage this issue and organize more conversations like this around this. So thank you so much for joining today. I think we have had a fantastic sort of 2.5 hours of discussion. Tamim Saab, Ambassador Katju, Ambassador Sood, General Hooda, Tamanna, and Rusum Saab, who had to sort of leave. All of you, thank you so much for joining this, and the audience for patiently listening to all of us and asking those questions. Thank you all so much, and thank you on behalf of CSDR. You have a nice evening and a good morning to you, Tamanna.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.